This was a church that was in a spiritual crisis. They were in a cultural crisis. They were dealing with racial issues. They were dealing with economic issues. They were dealing with things like sexuality and gender identity issues. They were dealing with political issues. They were dealing with spiritual issues, weird theology, what we would maybe even now call celebrity pastors. It was everything that in some ways, at least the church in the West is facing today. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to kind of the 0 episode of Season 2. I'm here with Pastor Miles Langrock.
I'm here with Dr. Brian Jenkins.
And we are both so excited as we're getting ready to kick off Season 2 of Theology Threads. So many fun and innovative things, which we'll get to in the podcast formally once that drops. But we are going to be spending the entire season studying a book. So in Season 1, we kind of worked through various topics that we felt like would be important to people or people would want to know about. This season, we're going to be really working through a book of the Bible that we both feel is very relevant and current to our time. So we're going to be working through Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians, or as our friends across the pond would say, 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, nice.
So we're going to be working through that. And so because of that, one thing that Miles and I have decided to do is kind of do a 0 episode. We're going to do some background, some context, and really talk about not just what about 1 Corinthians do I need to know, but even key questions that anyone should ask when they are studying the Bible or for themselves. So we want this to be as much of an educational and empowering experience as it is a learning experience. So
yeah, it's significant to go into the context of the passage. It was written, some 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so there's nuances and cultural things that are coming up in these passages that we're completely unfamiliar with in today's modern age. And so it's good to just know what's going on in these passages and who wrote it, when was it written, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you'll hear us say oftentimes on any of the platforms the phrase "do the work." I think we say that a lot. In fact,
we got a mug somewhere, right?
We got a mug somewhere that says it, "Do the work." But when we say "do the work," what work? And I realize I say "do the work," but I don't always help people learn the work. So we want to talk about doing the work. And doing the work for us, when we talk about that, always means putting the passages in, around, or in the setting of what we call the original context, right? And one of the big lines I use quite a bit, it's kind of silly or maybe it's cute or whatever, but I think it's still pretty powerful. Any text without a context is a con.
Nice,
right?
I like
Any
that.
text without a context is a con. So words matter.
Yeah.
How words are set matter, and where the words come from matter. And so what we want to do in this podcast is kind of talk through, or not in this podcast, but in this particular episode, talk through some key questions and then apply those questions to 1 Corinthians.
Certainly. So this was this passage that we have, this book. Who wrote it? When was it written? And to whom did he write it?
Right. So let's take a moment and work through those 3 questions. Who wrote it? When did they write it? And to whom was it written? Mm-hmm. Anytime you start studying a book of the Bible, whatever book it is, those are some of the most critical questions you need to ask. Because it is incredibly important to remember that real people really wrote these to other real people.
Right.
Okay? Never forget that when you're reading the Bible. Now, we have a theological belief about inspiration, that God is literally breathing. Paul makes that very clear to Timothy, that all Scripture is breathed of God. So there is an inspiration, there is an inerrancy, there are all those sort of fundamental beliefs that we have about Scripture that come with it. But ultimately, it's within a context. They're written by a real person to real people for a purpose. Mm-hmm. So when we take that and we apply it to this, we're looking at Paul the apostle, who had the Jewish name Saul, used later on in his ministry career his Roman name or his Latin name, Paul, as he became a minister primarily to Gentiles rather than Jewish ethnic Jewish people. He began to say, hey, I really feel like God's moving me in to be essentially an apostle, and we'll get to that in the first episode, but an apostle or a missionary or a sent one. Actually, it's the one whom is sent by one to the Gentiles. And so it is Paul of Scripture. probably lived somewhere roughly probably contemporaries with the life of Jesus, obviously dies somewhere probably in the late to mid 60s AD in Rome. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Paul.
So Paul wrote it, and it's called 1 Corinthians. So one might assume that he wrote it to a people called the Corinthians.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I got one.
So,
Nice.
yeah, nailed it. Well done. So we know that Paul founded a church in the town of what's called Corinth. And Corinth is in modern Greece to this day. It's an incredible port city. And really, this is where the location and the audience becomes critical. Because these were people who were living real lives at a real time in history. And Corinth had become this massive port city that really the world was coming through. And it's probably written somewhere in the mid-50s AD, probably in or around the events of Acts 18. So if you want to see Paul planting the church in Acts 18, then you can read that and then go on and say, oh, these are the people that he's writing to. So we know that he's the founder of this church, but Paul was a planter in the truest sense, that he did not sustain churches. He would start them, and then he would hand them over to local leadership, and then he would advise that leadership with his spiritual authority as that church grew. But he was moving from town to town. So you have Corinth. Corinth, incredible city. It was really a hub of the ancient world. One of the primary resources we'll use for this is obviously Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians. And it really is described as sort of if you were to take New York, LA, and Las Vegas for our American listeners and jam it all into one city. Okay, so if you're not American and you're watching or you're a part of our community, it would be like taking like London, Paris, and like Amsterdam and cramming them all into one city. You have intellectual centers like Paris and Berlin, or rather London and Berlin. You have artistic, cultural centers like Paris, Venice, Florence, that kind of a thing. And then you would have a really entertainment, wild sort of people living out their lives however they wanted to, which is obviously one of the stereotypes about Amsterdam. And so really it's kind of all these crazy cities put together. If you're a comic books fan, it would be like Madripoor all in one city. So there you go.
Which comics?
That would be Marvel Comics.
Marvel, okay. All right, got it. Thank you. Okay. So Paul had been there previously. He'd been in Corinth. He established...
planted this church.
Planted this church there. He was there for a while. And he's writing to them, so we have to assume that he's not there.
Right.
But he's writing to them. Why is he writing to them?
Yeah, and that is really one of the cool things, because that lets us know if he's writing to them for a reason, that helps explain some of the things he's talking about.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's kind of a circular thing that we do in hermeneutics, which is we look at the text of the passage or the text of the letter to determine the issues he's probably talking about. And then you sort of flip that back around and say, okay, now we can interpret these passages if these are the issues. Okay. So what we do know is that this isn't actually the first letter he's ever written to the Corinthians. He wrote a previous letter, but that letter's not kept within the canon. So this is a letter that he writes. So it gets a little tricky here. So he writes a letter about something. Someone sends him a letter back saying, hey, there's some real weird stuff going on in that church. We'll get to the specifics of that in the first episode. So then he writes what we now call 1 Corinthians, essentially to address several critical issues, all under the overarching theme of a church divided. That's why we're kind of calling this season 1 Corinthians a church in crisis. This was a church that was in a spiritual crisis. They were in a cultural crisis. They were dealing with racial issues. They were dealing with economic issues. They were dealing with things like sexuality and gender identity issues. They were dealing with political issues. They were dealing with spiritual issues, weird theology, what we would maybe even now call celebrity pastors. It was everything that in some ways, at least the church in the West is facing today. And so that's one of the biggest reasons. So Paul writes them this letter to begin to help them navigate through these issues. So it's written for the reason, in hermeneutics we call this the occasion. It was written for the occasion to really help them work through the issues that were dividing them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned that it's written as a letter, and the Bible is not just, I mean, it's a book, but it's a library of books, right? There's so many different types of literature in here, and so this is commonly referred to it as an epistle.
Right.
Is there any more that we want to describe as like the genre of?
Yeah, so epistles were letters. It's what they called a letter, and in the Greek world, they had specific forms. And it's interesting because Paul follows the forms of other even secular epistles where you would write to someone. He has a very specific greeting format that he uses. He has a thanksgiving format that he uses in terms of thanking God or expressing gratitude. He will then go on to sort of an intellectual or theological conceptual diatribe where he often will use like a straw man, which is sort of the Socratic thing where you create someone who's asking questions and then you answer those questions. And then he moves on to this very practical, now here's what you should do. And the vast majorities of Paul's book, you could almost cut that in half. Theological, practical. There's usually like a linchpin moment in the middle, and we'll even be able to show that. So that's what an epistle was. It's simply a letter.
It's a letter written to, is it the entire church of Corinth? Is it just a few? Is it meant to be read like with everyone present or just kind of passed around?
Yeah. So we'll get in a little bit of that. That's actually a really great question. I would argue that it was meant to be read by everyone to everyone, preferably in the same sitting, which is going to lead to some high levels of awkwardness as we move forward.
If he starts calling anyone out.
Well, he names names very specifically.
And it's canonized. So
now
we know.
We know. Yeah, we know who you were. So yeah.
Right on. Okay, well, is there anything else about the historical, cultural context of this passage?
I think that what we really want to do is, what we will be relying on is sort of the school of thought of hermeneutics that I use. And I use what's called the historical literary context, which means that I take the literary genre of any given book or passage that I'm using, I set it within its original historical context, and then from there, pull out, or mine, if you will, derive, and hopefully exegete out of that principles, meanings, theological statements, truths, that kind of stuff. But our process over this season will be, what did it mean to them before we ask, what is it saying to us?
Right, and it's very important, I know we've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's very important to start off that way, because very easily if we start to insert our own ideas, our own, modern things that we encounter and try to put that into the text first, we start creating the Bible as we see it, or as we are, versus as it is.
Which is actually, as we'll see in our first episode, one of the big problems, is they were doing exactly that. They were trying to come up with a God and a version of the gospel that worked for them, not that they would serve. So pretty critical stuff. One other resource that we'll have is we'll actually have a study, kind of an overall study cheat sheet that you'll be able to download and use as you're working through 1 Corinthians. So it's going to be a great season. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, can't wait to jump in.
All right. Well, maybe we should start.
Let's do this.
Okay.